Have you ever walked through Amsterdam on a warm Saturday afternoon, sat down at a canal-side cafe and just watched? Because if you have, you've probably noticed something that nobody really talks about. You see these tall, confident, impossibly stylish Dutch women, laughing loudly, cycling past in heels like it's nothing, ordering wine without checking the price, and they're sitting across from men who are clearly not from here. Men with different accents, different mannerisms, different ways of moving through the world, and you think to yourself, is this a coincidence, or is something else going on? My name is Julia. I'm a travel and dating coach, and I've spent the last several years living in, studying, and falling in love with the cultures of different countries. I've sat in kitchens with local women across the globe, had brutally honest conversations over coffee that went on for hours, done the research, lived the experience. And today, we are diving deep into one of the most fascinating social phenomena I have ever come across, the very real, very layered, and surprisingly moving story of why Dutch women are so powerfully drawn to foreigners. This is not a simple story. It is not a stereotype. It is not a clickbait answer. It is a human story rooted in history, psychology, culture, and the universal human desire to feel truly seen. So get comfortable, because we are going to be here for a while. Part 1. Understanding the Dutch woman first. Before we can talk about who Dutch women are attracted to, we have to understand who Dutch women actually are. And I mean really understand them. Not the postcard version, not the cliches about tulips and windmills and being tall. We need to get underneath all of that. The Netherlands is, by almost every measurable standard, one of the most progressive, egalitarian, and socially liberated countries on Earth. Dutch women have had access to birth control since the 1960s, a genuine welfare state that supports working mothers, and a cultural philosophy built around the concept of the polder model, which basically means everyone gets a say, everyone's voice matters, and compromise is a form of respect. Sounds like paradise, right? In many ways, it absolutely is. Dutch women are raised to be independent, direct, and self-sufficient. From a young age, they're told they do not need a man to define them. They earn their own money, pay their own bills, split restaurant checks with remarkable matter-of-factness, and have very little patience for games or emotional manipulation. If a Dutch woman thinks you're being dishonest with her, she will tell you, calmly, clearly, and without drama, that you need to get your act together or she's moving on. That confidence is not an act. It is deeply baked into the culture. But here's the thing that nobody from the outside ever quite understands until they actually live there. That same culture of radical directness and pragmatism can sometimes feel, in the context of romance and dating, like the oxygen has been slightly sucked out of the room. Dutch dating culture is famously efficient. People meet, they assess compatibility with almost clinical precision, they decide quickly whether to invest or move on. There's not a lot of lingering. There's not a lot of that giddy, slightly irrational early-stage romance where someone sends you flowers for no reason or shows up at your door because they just missed you. That kind of behavior in the Netherlands is sometimes actually viewed with suspicion. People wonder what you're hiding or what you want. I had a long conversation about this with a Dutch woman named Lotte. She's in her early 30s, works in sustainable architecture in Utrecht, and has dated extensively both within the Netherlands and internationally. She said something to me that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. She said, "In the Netherlands, we are very good at being equal. We are not always so good at being romantic, and sometimes those two things are at war with each other." She wasn't being self-critical. She was being observational. She loves her country. She loves Dutch values. But she had noticed over the years that there was something she was searching for that her own cultural environment didn't always deliver, and she had started to find it in the men she met from other places. From Italy, from Brazil, from Nigeria, from Lebanon. Men who brought a different energy to the table, who expressed things differently, who related to her not just as an equal partner in a rational arrangement, but as a woman, fully, unreservedly, with all the warmth and occasional irrationality that love actually requires. This is where our story truly begins. Part 2. The Directness Paradox. There's something I call the Directness Paradox, and it plays out in Dutch romantic culture in a way that is both fascinating and a little heartbreaking when you first understand it. Dutch people, as I mentioned, are extraordinarily direct. If a Dutch man is interested in you, he might simply say so, plainly, without flourish, almost like a business proposition. I find you attractive. Would you like to go for a drink sometime? And on the surface, that sounds great. No guessing games, no mixed signals, no 3-day waiting rule, just honest, transparent communication. The feminist in me absolutely respects that. But here's the paradox. The very directness that feels so liberating in every other area of Dutch life can, in the specific context of early romantic attraction, strip away a quality that many people, men and women alike, find deeply compelling. That quality is tension. The delicious, slightly agonizing uncertainty of not quite knowing. The held breath before the phone buzzes. The moment when someone says something that could mean one thing or another, and your heart has to decide which interpretation it wants to believe. Dutch dating, because of its directness and efficiency, often leapfrogs over all of that. And for women who are already very self-sufficient, already very rational, already very much in control of their own lives, the absence of that tension can make dating feel a little like checking items off a to-do list. You meet, you assess, you decide. Next. I spoke with another woman, Femke, who teaches at the University of Amsterdam. She put it this way: the Dutch system is very logical, but love is not logical. And I think sometimes Dutch men and Dutch women are so committed to being logical about everything that we forget to be a little bit foolish. And foolishness, a certain kind of beautiful foolishness, is actually part of what makes falling in love feel real. When Dutch women encounter men from cultures where romantic expression is more elaborate, where a man might write you a handwritten note or call you spontaneously in the middle of the afternoon just to hear your voice, or show up to a date looking like he spent an actual hour thinking about how he looks, something shifts inside them. Not because these women are superficial, not because they want to be swept off their feet in some fairy tale sense, but because those gestures communicate something that raw directness sometimes doesn't, that you matter enough for someone to make an effort, that you are worth a little bit of beautiful foolishness. This is not a criticism of Dutch men. I want to be very clear about that. Dutch men, broadly speaking, are respectful, reliable, and genuinely treat women as equals in ways that men from many other cultures still struggle to manage. This is a story about chemistry, about what happens when you introduce different cultural vocabularies of love into the same space. And the Netherlands, because of its openness, its internationalism, and its extraordinary appeal to immigrants and expats from around the world, has become one of the most extraordinary laboratories for exactly that. Part 3. The expat effect. Who is actually coming to the Netherlands? Let's talk about who is actually moving to the Netherlands, because this matters enormously to our story. The Netherlands punches dramatically above its weight as an international destination. It has the 5th largest port in the world in Rotterdam. It's home to the International Court of Justice and dozens of multinational corporations. Amsterdam is consistently ranked among the top 5 most livable cities on the planet. Wageningen University is a global leader in agricultural science. Eindhoven has a technology scene that rivals anything you'll find in Northern Europe. And the Dutch university system attracts tens of thousands of international students every year, with instruction offered in English at the highest academic levels. What this means, practically, is that the Netherlands has an unusually high concentration of educated, ambitious, culturally curious foreigners. These are not people who stumbled here by accident. They are people who chose the Netherlands, often out of many alternatives, because it offered something specific: intellectual rigor, social openness, quality of life, and an international atmosphere. They tend to be multilingual, cosmopolitan, and comfortable moving between worlds. And they bring with them the full texture of their home cultures, the warmth and family-centeredness of Southern European men, the expressiveness and musicality of Latin American men, the deep social intelligence and communal generosity of West African men, the romantic idealism and literary sensibility of Middle Eastern men, the quiet intensity and thoughtfulness of East Asian men, the easy confidence and storytelling ability of American and British men. Now imagine being a Dutch woman, brilliant, independent, pragmatic, and suddenly your social circle includes people from all of these backgrounds. People who grew up with completely different ideas about what romance looks like, what love sounds like, what it means to truly pursue someone you care about. It's not that these men are better than Dutch men, it's that they're different in ways that feel complementary. I remember talking with a group of Dutch women at a dinner party in Haarlem. There were about 7 of them, ranging from their late 20s to their mid-40s. When the conversation turned to dating foreigners, the room lit up in a way I hadn't seen all evening. One woman, a marketing director named Annalise, said, "The first time a man from abroad cooked for me, and I mean really cooked with music playing and a recipe from his grandmother, I realized I had never had that experience before. Not once. It sounds small, but it wasn't small at all. It was a whole world opening up." That image, a grandmother's recipe, music in the kitchen, a man putting thought and care and cultural history into feeding someone he's interested in, encapsulates something important. It's not about the food, it's about the gesture. It's about a different cultural tradition of courtship expressing itself in a single ordinary evening and feeling, to the woman receiving it, like something almost miraculous. Part 4, the Southern European Pull, Italy, Spain, and Greece. Let me take you through some of the specific cultural connections that Dutch women talk about most often, because the nuances here are genuinely fascinating. Southern European men, Italians, Spaniards, Greeks, Portuguese, consistently appear at the top of any informal list Dutch women compile when talking about international dating experiences that have surprised and moved them. And the reasons are wonderfully specific. Italian men, in the Dutch female imagination, represent a particular archetype, the man who is unafraid of beauty, who dresses carefully not out of vanity, but out of a deep cultural understanding that how you present yourself is a form of respect for yourself and for the people you're with, who talks about food, art, and family with the same passionate investment that a Dutch person might talk about cycling infrastructure or sustainability policy, who touches your arm when he makes a point not intrusively, but because in his culture, physical proximity is part of how warmth is communicated. For Dutch women who have grown up in a culture of measured physical distance and emotional restraint, this can feel transformative. Not overwhelming, Dutch women are far too grounded for that, but genuinely revelatory. The experience of being with someone who expresses joy and affection and interest in an entirely different physical register can fundamentally rewire your understanding of what intimacy can look like. Mikey, a physiotherapist from Rotterdam in her late 30s, told me about a relationship she had with a man from Naples. She said, "He had this quality I can only describe as abundance, emotional abundance. He never made me feel like I was asking for too much by having feelings." In Dutch culture, we are very good at being reasonable about emotions. He was not reasonable at all. He was excessive. And I discovered that I loved it. Spanish men bring a similar warmth, but with their own particular flavor, a combination of fierce pride, easy sociability, and a relationship to time that Dutch women find simultaneously maddening and secretly liberating. The Spanish concept of mañana, the willingness to let the evening stretch as long as it wants to rather than watching the clock, can feel deeply foreign to someone raised in a culture of meticulous punctuality. But many Dutch women describe learning to surrender to that slowness as one of the great unexpected gifts of international romance. Greek men, meanwhile, tend to bring something that Dutch women specifically describe as gravity, a seriousness about connection that feels both traditional and oddly modern. The Greek emphasis on family, on loyalty, on the idea that a relationship is something you tend like a garden rather than a transaction you complete, can resonate powerfully with Dutch women who are tired of the efficiency model of dating and want something that feels more rooted. Part 5. The Latin American Connection: Brazil, Colombia, Argentina. If Southern Europe represents one pole of the foreign attraction phenomenon, Latin America represents another. Louder, more kinetic, and in some ways even more dramatic in its impact on Dutch women who encounter it. Brazil deserves its own paragraph. Brazilian culture, and Brazilian men, when they arrive in the Netherlands, typically via the tech industry, the arts, or international study, carries with it an almost overwhelming vitality. The Brazilian way of being in the world, which involves music and dance and physical expression and a fundamental conviction that life should be enjoyed rather than merely managed, can feel, to a Dutch woman, like being pulled out of black and white into full color. I spent an afternoon with a Dutch woman named Hanneke, who had been in a long-term relationship with a man from São Paulo. She is an economist, precise and analytical by both training and temperament, and she laughed when she told me the story of their first date. He had shown up with a playlist, an actual curated playlist, and at some point in the evening he had pulled her up to dance in the middle of a park. Not in a club, in a park, in the middle of the afternoon. She said, "I was mortified and delighted in equal measure. I had never danced in a park. It never occurred to me that dancing in a park was something people did. He thought it was the most natural thing in the world." That park moment, that collision between Dutch self-consciousness and Brazilian uninhibitedness, is a perfect microcosm of what happens when these two worlds meet. And what many Dutch women discover after their initial mortification fades is that they actually want more of that feeling. The feeling of being invited to be a little less in control, a little more present, a little more willing to be seen. Colombian men bring a different texture, perhaps slightly more formally romantic, with a stronger tradition of elaborate courtship, of being very deliberate about demonstrating interest. If a Colombian man is pursuing you, you know it. He will find reasons to be where you are. He will remember small things you mentioned weeks ago and bring them back in conversation in ways that make you feel profoundly paid attention to. For Dutch women, who are accustomed to a dating culture where interest is communicated straightforwardly but without enormous ceremony, this experience of being intentionally and elaborately courted can feel genuinely new. And Argentine men bring perhaps the most intellectually charged romantic energy of all the Latin American cultures. Argentina has an extraordinary literary and philosophical tradition, and Argentine men who arrive in the Netherlands often carry this with them, a love of debate, of ideas, of the kind of conversation that goes in unexpected directions and ends at 3 in the morning when you both realize you've completely lost track of time. For Dutch women, who are themselves highly educated and intellectually engaged, finding someone who matches that intellectual energy while also bringing warmth, expressiveness, and a certain theatrical charm can feel like winning some extraordinary romantic lottery. Part 6. Africa and the Middle East. Dimensions of warmth and depth. I want to spend real time here because these connections are often the most profound, and also the ones that Dutch women talk about with the most emotional weight and complexity. West African men, from Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, Ivory Coast, bring to the Netherlands something that many Dutch women describe, searching for the right word, as communal warmth. The African cultural tradition of Ubuntu, the idea that a person is a person through other people, that individual identity is inseparable from community, expresses itself in how these men relate to the people around them. There's a generosity, a readiness to include, a way of making space for others that feels very different from the more individualistic social patterns of Northern Europe. I spoke with Danique, a Dutch woman working in international development in The Hague, who had been deeply involved with a man from Accra. She said, "What he taught me, and I don't know if he even knew he was teaching me, was that you can be strong and also deeply tender." He had this kind of emotional intelligence that wasn't performative, it was just real. And he was completely unashamed of it. He would say exactly how he felt, not because he had read a self-help book about it, but because in his culture, that was just how you were with the people you cared about. She also talked about something that many Dutch women mention in the context of relationships with men from more communal cultures: the experience of being welcomed into a family. Dutch families, she said, are loving but tend toward independence. You visit for Sunday dinners, you maintain separate lives. His family was different. They called constantly. They wanted to know everything about her. They sent her food. They prayed for her. At first she found it overwhelming. Eventually she found it beautiful. North African and Middle Eastern men, from Morocco, Tunisia, Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, introduce yet another dimension. There's a strong tradition in these cultures of romantic idealism, of poetry, of the idea that love is something sacred and worthy of extreme effort. Arab romantic culture has a literary tradition going back 1,000 years that treats love as the highest form of human experience. When men from these cultures arrive in the Netherlands, they often carry that idealism with them, and the collision with Dutch pragmatism can produce something unexpectedly beautiful. A Dutch woman named Saskia, a documentary filmmaker, told me about falling in love with a Lebanese man she met at a film festival in Amsterdam. She said, "He wrote me a letter, an actual physical letter, on paper, with his handwriting. I hadn't received a handwritten letter since I was a child. I sat in my kitchen and read it 3 times and I cried, and I am not a person who cries easily." He wrote about the way I talked about cinema. He wrote about things I had said that he was still thinking about. He made me feel like a work of art, and I didn't know I needed that. That letter, that experience of being written to, truly written to, with care and attention and eloquence, it points to something universal in this whole story. What Dutch women are responding to, across all these different cultures and all these different men, is the experience of being seen in a particular way. Not just evaluated, not just assessed for compatibility, but seen as a full, complex, beautiful human being whose presence in someone's life is an extraordinary thing. Part 7. The psychological dimension. What is actually happening inside? I want to get a little deeper now, because I think it would be dishonest to tell this story without looking at the psychology underneath it. When psychologists study cross-cultural attraction, one of the most consistent findings is the concept of optimal distinctiveness, the idea that humans are drawn to things that feel both familiar enough to be comfortable and different enough to be interesting. In a country as internationally connected as the Netherlands, where English is essentially a second native language, and where Dutch people travel constantly and have friends from everywhere, foreigners are simultaneously very familiar and genuinely different. The optimal distinctiveness sweet spot is almost built into the environment. But there's something else going on, and it's slightly more uncomfortable to talk about, which means we absolutely should. Dutch society, for all its extraordinary achievements in gender equality, still carries within it the inevitable tensions and contradictions of any society that has undergone rapid social change. The feminist revolution of the 1960s and 70s in the Netherlands was genuinely revolutionary. But revolutions create their own complicated afterlives. Men and women who were raised in this environment of radical equality sometimes struggle to reconcile the egalitarian principles they've internalized with the more traditional romantic scripts that still resonate somewhere in the emotional architecture. A Dutch man raised to believe in perfect equality might feel genuinely uncertain about whether it's okay to pay for dinner, to hold a door, to make the first move, not because he's weak or indecisive, but because he's received genuine social signals that these things might not be welcome. He might default to splitting everything precisely, keeping everything balanced, because that's the culturally safe position. And a Dutch woman who may have insisted loudly and often that she doesn't need a man to pay for anything or open any doors might still feel, somewhere she doesn't always announce, a small wistfulness for the experience of someone simply wanting to take care of her. Not because she needs it, but because being wanted and being cared for, even symbolically, is one of the oldest human experiences there is. Foreigners, particularly those from cultures with more traditional gender dynamics, often do these things, not as a statement of power or ownership, but as a natural expression of courtship. They pay for dinner, they plan the date, they bring flowers, they remember anniversaries, they tell you you're beautiful regularly, without prompting. And Dutch women, who have every intellectual argument in place about why these things are symbolic constructs of the patriarchy, sometimes find that their hearts do not entirely agree with their heads. This is not a betrayal of feminism. This is the complicated, messy, beautiful truth about human beings. We contain multitudes. We can believe in one set of principles and feel something quite different. We can vote for gender equality and still want to be romanced. Both of these things are real. Both of them can coexist. And the Netherlands, perhaps precisely because it is so committed to intellectual honesty, is a country where women are increasingly willing to admit this out loud. Part 8. The Language of Love. Literally. Here is something that nobody ever puts in the headline, but that almost every Dutch woman I spoke with mentioned when we got deep enough into the conversation. Language. Not language as in communication style, language as in actual, literal language. The experience of being spoken to in a foreign tongue, or even of listening to someone speak Dutch with an accent, carries an extraordinary emotional charge for many people. Think about it from a Dutch woman's perspective. She has heard Dutch her entire life. Every compliment, every declaration of affection, every term of endearment. She has heard it in Dutch, in the flat vowels and direct cadences of a language that is beautiful, but not, by global consensus, the most inherently romantic-sounding language on earth. And then she meets someone who calls her Bella, or Habibi, or Linda, or Mon cœur. And even if she knows perfectly well what these words mean, they land differently. They carry a foreignness that somehow makes them hit harder. They feel less worn, less ordinary. There is research to support this, actually. Studies in psycholinguistics have found that hearing emotional content in a second language produces a different neurological response than hearing it in a native language. The emotional regulation systems are less activated, meaning the words land with more force rather than less. The familiar language is like a well-worn path. The foreign language is terrain you have to genuinely navigate, and that navigation requires a kind of presence and attention that intensifies the experience. I asked several Dutch women about this specifically, and the responses were unanimous and enthusiastic. Noor, a journalist from Leiden, said, "When my partner speaks French, even just casually when he's on the phone with his mother, I feel something. I can't explain it rationally. It's just beautiful to hear. And when he says things to me in French that he feels in French, not translated from Dutch, they hit me differently, more deeply somehow." And there's also the Dutch accent issue from the other direction. Dutch women who speak English or French or Spanish, which is essentially all of them, are often described by foreign men as seductive precisely because of the distinctive musicality of their accent. So there's this linguistic dance happening in both directions, where each party finds the other's relationship to language novel and appealing. It's a kind of constant low-level strangeness that keeps attraction alive. Part 9. Amsterdam as the epicenter. We can't have this conversation without talking specifically about Amsterdam, because Amsterdam is in a category entirely its own. Amsterdam is not a typical Dutch city any more than New York is a typical American city. It is the international face of the Netherlands, a place that has been drawing outsiders, artists, traders, refugees, and adventurers for 400 years. It was, at the height of the Dutch Golden Age, the most cosmopolitan city on Earth. That DNA is still very much present. Today, Amsterdam has a population where nearly 60% of residents have at least one parent born outside the Netherlands. Entire neighborhoods feel more like a city of cities than a single coherent cultural entity. You can walk from the Jordaan to the Pipe to the De Barges and feel like you're changing countries with each canal you cross. The restaurant scene is staggeringly international. The art scene pulls from every corner of the globe. The nightlife brings together people from literally dozens of countries in the same small, crowded, deliriously fun spaces. In this environment, the kind of cross-cultural romantic encounters we've been talking about don't feel exotic or unusual. They feel like Tuesday. They feel like the natural result of simply going about your life in a city that has always been built on the idea that people from everywhere should be able to coexist and thrive. But Amsterdam also has a specific energy around dating that the rest of the Netherlands doesn't quite replicate. It's faster, more anonymous, more experimental. There are dating app cultures and underground art parties and canal boat meetups and international networking events that serve double duty as very sophisticated matchmaking environments. Dutch women in Amsterdam are, in many cases, the most internationally connected women in the country. They have colleagues and friends and exes from 40 different places, and their understanding of what a relationship can look like has been shaped by all of that exposure. I walked through the Vondel Park one Sunday with a woman named Roos, who works for an international NGO and has lived in 5 countries. She was telling me about the men she'd dated over the years: a Jordanian architect, an American academic, a Nigerian musician, a Colombian chef. She said, "Amsterdam gave me permission to be curious about everything: food, music, ideas, people. And once you're that curious, you can't go back to being less curious. You want to keep discovering. And people, the right people, are the most interesting thing to discover." That curiosity, that fundamental, deep-seated Dutch intellectual curiosity applied to human beings and romantic possibilities, might be the most important thread running through this entire story. Part 10, The Complications, because this isn't just a love story. I would be doing you a disservice if I presented this as a straightforwardly romantic narrative without acknowledging the very real complications and challenges that come with cross-cultural relationships in the Netherlands. Immigration, for one, is enormously complex in Dutch society. The Netherlands has gone through significant political upheaval over questions of immigration and integration, and the cultural tensions around these questions are real and ongoing. A Dutch woman who falls in love with a man from Morocco or Turkey or Nigeria is not just entering a relationship. She is, in a very concrete sense, navigating a set of social pressures and family dynamics and political contexts that don't apply to purely domestic relationships. Some Dutch families, especially in more traditional or more conservative communities, have complicated reactions to their daughters bringing home men from very different backgrounds. The open-minded internationalism of Amsterdam is not universally shared across the country. In smaller cities and in rural areas, social attitudes can be considerably more traditional, and interracial or interreligious relationships can encounter genuine resistance. There are also the practical complications of maintaining a relationship between two people from fundamentally different cultural universes. Communication styles clash in ways that are funny at first and exhausting later. Assumptions about family obligation, about gender roles within the home, about religious practice, about how money should be managed, about what it means to be a good partner. All of these things are shaped by culture in ways that we often don't even notice until they collide with someone else's completely different assumptions. I spoke frankly about this with several women who had been in long-term cross-cultural relationships, and they were honest with me. The excitement of early-stage difference is real, they said, but difference is not always charming. Sometimes it's frustrating. Sometimes it's isolating. Sometimes it makes you feel fundamentally misunderstood in ways that are difficult to resolve through good intentions alone. One woman who had been married to a man from Egypt for several years told me, "The romance was extraordinary, and the work was also extraordinary, in a different way. We had to learn each other's worlds from the inside. It took years. There were times when I thought we were too different. But what we built, because of those differences, through them, is stronger than anything I think I could have built with someone who already understood me from the start. The understanding we have now is earned, and that feels more real." That phrase, earned understanding, strikes me as perhaps the most honest and important thing anyone said to me in all my conversations about this topic. Cross-cultural love requires a particular kind of sustained, deliberate effort that domestic love often does not. You cannot take for granted that the other person shares your frame of reference. You have to constantly translate, not just words, but entire systems of meaning, and that translation, done with love and patience, creates an intimacy that is perhaps uniquely deep precisely because it was so deliberately constructed. Part 11. What Dutch women say they've learned after all these conversations, all these stories, all these dinners and coffees and long afternoons. I started asking a slightly different question. Not, why are you attracted to foreign men? But, what have you learned about yourself, about love, about the world, from these relationships? The answers were, without exception, extraordinary. Roos, from Amsterdam, told me she had learned that efficiency is not the same as intimacy. "I used to approach relationships the way I approach my work, systematically, with clear goals, with regular check-ins. My relationship with Carlos taught me that love has its own rhythm and you don't get to manage it. You have to let it take you somewhere. Annalise, the marketing director, told me she had learned that she was capable of more vulnerability than she had ever allowed herself in Dutch relationships. In the Netherlands, showing need feels like weakness. With Marco, I learned that showing need is actually a form of trust. When I say I need you, I'm not saying I can't survive without you. I'm saying I choose to need you. That distinction changed everything for me. Hanukkah, the economist, told me she had learned about her own body, that joy is physical, that pleasure is not something to be scheduled, that dancing in a park is actually not embarrassing. It's just dancing. I am a more alive person than I was before. I think I'd gone a little numb without realizing it, not because of anyone's fault, just because the culture around me didn't really encourage aliveness. Femke, the university lecturer, told me she had learned that intellectual rigor and emotional expressiveness are not opposites. I used to think that if you felt something very strongly, you probably weren't thinking clearly about it. My partner from Lebanon cured me of that. He is the most rigorous intellectual I know, and also the most emotionally fearless. He taught me that feelings can be precise. Danique, the development worker, told me she had learned about community, that love is not just between two people, that a relationship is embedded in a much larger human context, and that welcoming that context rather than protecting yourself from it is one of the deepest forms of openness you can practice. And Saskia, the filmmaker, told me, and this is the one I return to most often, that she had learned about time. In the Netherlands, we treat time like a resource to be optimized. The cultures I've been exposed to through love treat time differently, as something to live inside of rather than get through. I've started trying to live inside of things. I'm not very good at it yet, but I'm learning. Part 12. The bigger picture. What does it say about us? Let's zoom out for a moment, because I think this story is not just about Dutch women and foreign men. I think it's about something that every one of us, regardless of where we're from, can recognize. We live in a world of increasing interconnection, of migration and travel and digital communication that collapses distances and brings people from radically different backgrounds into constant contact. And what the Dutch example shows us, perhaps more clearly than almost anywhere else in the world, is what happens when that interconnection is not resisted but genuinely embraced. The Netherlands opened itself, not without tension, not without ongoing struggle, not without getting many things wrong along the way, but it opened itself. And that opening created the conditions for a particular kind of human flourishing, the kind that happens when we stop assuming that our own cultural way of doing things is the only way and start genuinely learning from people who grew up with entirely different answers to the same deep questions. How do you love someone? How do you show them they matter? How do you build a life that feels worth living? How do you balance independence with connection, freedom with commitment, individual identity with shared belonging? Every culture has its answers, and those answers are different in ways that are sometimes superficial and sometimes profound. What happens when a Dutch woman falls in love with a man from Nairobi or Medellin or Beirut or Naples is not just that she encounters different answers to these questions. She is invited to reconsider the questions themselves, to hold her own cultural framework up to the light and see it clearly, its extraordinary strengths and its particular blind spots, for perhaps the first time. And that process, that deep, disorienting, exhilarating process of having your own world reflected back to you through someone else's eyes, might be the most important thing that cross-cultural love actually does, not just for Dutch women, for all of us. Part 13. The Dutch Men Response. It would be incomplete not to mention, briefly, how Dutch men have responded to all of this. And the truth is, it's complicated. Some Dutch men feel a genuine sense of disorientation. They grew up being told that equality was the goal, that they should be partners rather than pursuers, that the old romantic scripts were outdated and problematic, and then they watch women respond powerfully to men from cultures that still use many of those old scripts. It creates a kind of double bind that is genuinely difficult to navigate. I spoke with several Dutchmen about this. The most thoughtful among them said something that I found quietly profound. One man, a designer named Lars, said, "I think we may have overcorrected in some ways, not on the equality part, never on the equality part, but on the idea that romance and equality are somehow incompatible. They're not. You can be a completely equal partner and still light candles for dinner. You can split every bill and still write someone a love letter. We forgot that, or maybe we were never really taught it in the first place. There's something important in that. The lessons that Dutch women are learning from their cross-cultural relationships are, in many cases, lessons that could enrich domestic Dutch relationships too, if there were more space to have that conversation." And slowly, gradually, that conversation is happening. Dutch culture is changing. The question of what equality and romance look like together, rather than in opposition, is being genuinely grappled with. And in that grappling, something new is being made. Part 14. Looking forward. The Netherlands 10 years from now will be even more international than it is today. The trends are all pointing in one direction: more immigration, more international students, more multinational presence, more cross-cultural exchange. The social fabric of the country is becoming more complex, more textured, more global. And the generation of Dutch women who are growing up right now, who are already, at 18 or 20, more internationally connected and more cross-culturally experienced than any previous generation, will carry into their adult romantic lives a set of expectations and opennesses that is genuinely unprecedented. They will expect romance and equality simultaneously. They will expect a partner who sees them fully and loves them expressively and treats them as an equal and shows up for them and challenges them and learns from them and allows himself to be changed by them. They will expect, in other words, everything, because they have seen that everything is possible. And that might be the most Dutch thing of all about this story. The Dutch are, at their best, a profoundly ambitious people, not in a showy way, but in a deep, persistent, we will build a whole country below sea level if that's what it takes kind of way. They identify what they want, and they go after it with tremendous focus and ingenuity. What Dutch women want, it turns out, is love that is both equal and romantic, both honest and beautiful, both pragmatic and passionate. And they are going to the whole world to find it. And in doing so, they are perhaps teaching all of us something about what is possible when you refuse to accept that you have to choose. Conclusion. I started this story at a canal-side cafe, watching a Dutch woman laugh across the table at a man who was clearly not from here. I want to end it there too, because what I see now, knowing everything I've shared with you today, is not a woman who has rejected her own culture or abandoned her identity or fallen for some exotic fantasy. I see a woman who has done something quintessentially Dutch. She has looked at the world clearly, identified what she needed, and gone to find it. She has brought her full self, her directness, her independence, her intelligence, her pragmatism, into contact with a different world. And she is being changed by that contact, and she is changing it in return. That is not a story about obsession. It is a story about curiosity. It is a story about openness. It is a story about the profound and ongoing project of human connection across difference. And if you ask me, Julia, travel and dating expert, someone who has sat at a lot of tables in a lot of countries asking a lot of questions, I think it might be one of the most hopeful stories I know. Thanks for being here. I'll see you in the next one.